Nudged to the right is a one-volume history, documentary and set of stage monologues, chronicling the dissolution of civil liberties in the United Kingdom of the digital age, and the establishment of a new authoritarian system of all-pervasive public sector government, with discretionary power in the Home Office to break traditional laws protecting persons and property from absolute rule, which evolved historically under conditions of free market economic liberalism. The prospect of intrusive police video surveillance into homes, electrical and communications hijack, and the threat of harassment through infrasound, covert burglary, theft, and criminal damage by undercover officers authorised by the Home Secretary has effectively silenced criticism of the security lobby, extirpated whistleblowing, struck dumb the spokespersons of civil liberties organisations, turned investigative journalists mute, deterred organised public protests by all but a few naive young doctors, ended the centuries-old tradition of legal privilege, compromised the independence of court officials and juries, and left a huge void, or democratic deficit, in the political spectrum, which the Liberal Democrats vacated whilst in coalition with the Conservative Party. If Scottish MPs are barred from voting on English laws, if constituency boundaries are gerrymandered to favour the Conservatives, and, most crucially, if a credible opposition fails to materialise before the next general election in 2020, then the ruling autocrats are likely to command a huge, unassailable majority of MPs in our first-past-the-post parliamentary system, perhaps exceeding those of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, with a dictatorial mandate to continue extending the power of the state through advances in technology, unchecked by any real constitutional constraint, or by a judiciary which has been effectively marginalised by ministers in the power struggle of recent years. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom admired throughout the world as a beacon of liberal democracy, in which the exercise of arbitrary power had been consigned to history, and the only jeopardy faced by free people was from a legally constituted court. However, rule of the kingdom was quaintly constituted and intrinsically flawed. It had no written constitution, and therefore the people remained subjects of the crown. Immense power was placed in the hands of a small cabal of mendacious ministers. Erudite scholars began to whisper elected dictatorship and tyranny of convenience within the sound of silence. None of which seemed to matter very much to this happy breed in their sceptred isle, until the information surveillance complex came to dominate the political economy. Surveillance cameras and microphones spread from the streets into offices and homes, linked to databases proliferating throughout Whitehall, as if this had always been the natural state of governance, just waiting for the advent of Orwellian technology. Public sector armies of competing agencies were recruited to monitor the cameras, analyse the data, and build superhighways for the information surveillance complex, thus achieving the political holy grail, envisaged by Keynes et al. In the 1930s, of full employment which the boom-bust cycle of private sector capitalism was never able to sustain. But how can any kind of kingdom maintain a public sector which is comparable in size to the income-generating private sector in the digital age? By redistributing wealth generated by new technologies and mortgaging the future of the state to expansive growth, perhaps in the manner of fascist states in the 1930s. A public sector economy bestows arbitrary power on the ministers who control its vast resources and multitude of state-funded agencies, much like feudal lords with peasants on their baronial lands. A proposition rarely discussed publicly in the United Kingdom is that the digital revolution has transformed a bastion of liberalism into a nascent or proto-police state, something which writers of dystopian fiction have been prophesying ever since the publication of George Orwell's 1984, back in 1948, or even H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, published, somewhat ominously, in 1933. In 1977, BBC Television produced and broadcast a near-futurist dystopian drama series entitled 1990, which reflected the anxieties of the time in an entertaining, if logically inconsistent, portrayal of Orwellian government, modelled on East Germany and centred around the Home Office NHS, with its arbitrary power to detain dissidents for psychiatric treatment. Critics of the regime could have their citizenship revoked, reducing them to the status of outlaw, in the medieval sense of being outside the protection of the law. The popular series was never repeated, nor released on video or DVD. It seems to have vanished from the archive. The BBC refuses to comment. American movie moguls financed production of the Orwell-inspired Equilibrium in 2002 and V for Vendetta in 2005, which contain obvious allusions to contemporary British governance. Fictitious British dystopias, in print and on screen, like the modern-day reality, have their own distinct, idiosyncratic nature, which is more urbane and less brutal than the well-documented precedents of contemporary European history: Soviet Russia, Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Nationalist Spain, and East Germany. Foreign observers note that whilst Britain has more laws and regulations than most other countries, which the Home Secretary can implement or set aside at will, using powers delegated by Parliament, the uniformed police are generally better mannered. Meanwhile, the Home Office Star Chamber of Commissioners authorises undercover officers to commit acts of burglary, theft, criminal damage and perjury in the course of its harassment surveillance operations, with complete immunity from prosecution under English law. The government disavows the use of torture, whilst conducting infrasound attacks against its critics in their homes to induce nausea and cause sleep deprivation. Nudge is an official euphemism for these legally dubious activities which the Conservative-led government authorised policing agencies to carry out in the aftermath of the May 2010 general election. So how far has the United Kingdom moved down the road towards becoming a police state, whilst retaining a polite veneer of plurality? And what obvious characteristics, if any, does the dystopic regime of David Cameron share with those of Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Franco and Honecker?